everybody, and welcome to the Pop Occulture show, where we talk about the crossroads of pop culture and the occult. I am your co-host, Lilith Dorsey, and I am joined today in this festive holiday season with my co-host,
Jason Winslade, and we are at episode 7, and this is airing on winter solstice, so happy Yule, everyone.
Bless you all, yay!
Our guest today is a storyteller who's going to talk to us about Christmas ghosts. Amelia Cotter will be joining us shortly, and we're going to talk about all things ghostly and wintry for the winter solstice. So we'd like to welcome our guest today, Amelia Cotter, from Chicago, like myself, and is a storyteller. And tell us about what you do as a storyteller.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm an author and researcher, as well as a poet and a storyteller. So storyteller sort of brings together all of the different elements of what I do, including in my day job where I work in interpretation. I work with volunteers, helping them interpret so natural and historic spaces. Storytelling is, the oldest pastime on earth. I have a particular interest with that in supernatural, folklore, haunted history. And what I do with it practically is I go around and I talk about really cool stuff to groups of people, either online or in person.
Right, I saw you at an event last year at a store. You were telling some Christmas ghost stories, so I figured you were to be the perfect person to talk to on this winter solstice show.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is really cool. Thank you.
Yeah, so tell us about why are ghost stories particularly associated with winter solstice or winter in general, or Yule, Christmas? What is it about Christmas ghost stories that's become a thing in Western culture?
Sure. So yeah, it's exciting for me and for a lot of us that are into spooky stuff that Christmas ghost stories are kind of making a resurgence right now. But there is a long tradition of interest in the Western world going back thousands of years for people who were, when the days get shorter and work ends early, it's dark. People sit around the campfire or the candlelight in the evenings. And I believe, just from my personal research, that the natural inclination of humans is to want to tell each other spooky stories and ghost stories, and also share cautionary tales. So gossip, urban legends, all that kind of stuff kind of also that are the same umbrella together, being interested in these strange and salacious things. And so wintertime in the Northern Hemisphere is, also just a generally spooky time. And people, being afraid, especially children, being afraid of what's out there, what's beyond the safety of the home or the town wall, what's in the woods, that kind of stuff. So that has been a long oral tradition in many cultures. And for us, what we here in the US, I think most particularly identify with right now is sort of like this Victorian ghost story vibe. So I was looking into that a little bit, learning that, the printing press and industrialization brought books into a lot of people's homes. So more people were becoming literate in Victorian England. Victorian England, just sweet, painting with broad strokes, is like the mid 19th century era of England. So anyway, it kind of brought people closer to ghost stories. Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol came out in 1843, and that was immensely and hugely popular right away. And so people Victorians were super into spooky stuff anyway, and so people really enjoyed this Christmas traditions. So around the time when Christianity was taking hold, in the early 300s and 400s, Christianity was sort of taking on the different sort of some of the myths, traditions, and pastimes and holidays of various other cultures and religions. And so winter solstice was a big deal. in a lot of pagan traditions, and storytelling and being interested in ghosts and the idea of the liminality of winter time, days getting shorter, nights getting longer, and then eventually on the other side of that, the days getting longer again. We today associate Halloween with the idea that we're really close to the veil, but the Christmas time, as we understand it today, was also a very special time for people to be introspective and think about the connections between history, future, family, ancestry, and rebirth.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic.
Yeah, then there's a lot of, all the rituals of winter solstice are about the return of the light, but before the light returns, you gotta be in the dark. So it makes sense that would be that liminal, that in between space where you want those spooky qualities going on with your storytelling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like it's a time of balance as well, right? Like not only literal balance, but if we're going to look ahead with the coming of the new year and the coming of the light, we also have to look back to the ancestors and to where we've came from and how they're still present in our lives, maybe it only in a ghostly form.
Yeah, so the Dickens story is kind of like, we think of that as the quintessential Victorian ghost story. Obviously, that existed before Dickens, but Dickens is the person who popularized that, right?
Yeah, so during the era of Dickens, so Charles Dickens was probably the most popular writer in the world, in the literate Western world at the time. And I discovered that he wrote all sorts of stuff, like Great Expectations and all kinds of things. I just read A Christmas Carol for the first time. I've seen it with Muppets. I've seen it on stage. I've seen it with every single actor in it in the history of time. But I just read it for the first time recently, and it was really excellent. It's very short. It was published over the course of he wrote it in like 6 weeks, and published it, which was a fashion of the time here in the US and in Europe, sort of like in periodicals. And he also did a whole world tour of, well, let's say world being his world, but of doing readings of it himself, which I think is really cool. But yeah, so Christmas ghost stories published around Christmas time, so the commercialization of Christmas was very popular, and there were a lot of different ones to choose from. For whatever reason, A Christmas Carol, even compared to his other Christmas stories, is the one that has just taken hold. It took hold in England and Europe, and it was also extremely popular here. So Americans were more into like the soppy, syrupy kind of not ghostly, excuse me. I'm just used to saying that word 1,000 times. Kind of Christmas time tales. And so
A Wonderful Life type
Christmas,
stuff.
yeah, like A Christmas Carol was interesting because it folded in these ghostly narratives, which the English ate up. But for Americans, it was harder. It was harder to sort of break into that market, I guess. But everybody loved it, even people who thought it was corny. It was extremely popular at the time.
I remember just reading recently that there was a problem during his time of people plagiarizing it, and he had to like go after and try to get them to stop doing it, and he lost all this money, because it was so popular that everybody was just doing their own versions and publishing them.
Right. I didn't know that. That makes sense, though. That's funny. Yeah.
Yeah, and somebody stole a whole bunch of his money from one of the early runs. I found that out the other day too. So it's like, was very intense and extreme in Victorian times, not necessarily what we think of, but it was
People
rough.
pirating each other's, heartwarming Christmas plays.
Yeah, I think the popularity of that is what's interesting about that, just from a sort of a socio-political point of view, is and it's funny because you see all these memes now of like, you can't rely on your boss to be haunted by three spirits, join a union, there's that element of social change in there that I think would have been popular, especially with American audiences. But But I've always looked at it. Well, I mean, always, but since I've studied and become an occult person, I've always been very interested in the sort of esoteric elements of that. And there's a lot of a lot of people have written about the pagan elements, especially with the Ghost of Christmas Present. You have your sort of Yule Green Man type figure. References to other kinds of mythology, Norse mythology and druidry and all that kind of stuff. But there's also I always thought of it as sort of like almost an initiatory experience, because you have to kind of go into the underworld and with the ghosts and become transformed at the end of it, and that's what Scrooge goes through. I don't know what your take is on the story itself.
That's really cool because he does get away with a lot without getting too hardcore into even like a Christian message. It's like he kind of plays with a little bit of both, because the message is so very it's very heartwarming. It can be Christian, it doesn't have to be, but it's universal. And so I do feel like he was able to get away with a lot in there. I haven't thought about I was thinking about some of the connections to the esoteric, but when you mention it that way, it really is fascinating, like how much how much he must have already known about it, since he wrote it in such a short time, that he sort of like, I don't know, he whipped together this like universally timeless story. I really appreciate his genius, which is something so Christmas Carol, it wears on me every year. It's like some people complain about Mariah Carey. I'm fine with All I Want for Christmas. I see Christmas Carol, I'm like, oh, this again. I don't know why. Right, bah humbug. But after then reading it and really getting into the history and like talking to you guys about it and everything, I'm just like, oh, this is really cool. There's so much that we don't talk about or consider, because you get it, you get such a mouthful of it every winter, that you don't step back and see some of these really neat aspects of it.
Well, just from a
Yeah, I
performance,
feel like I just have to mention the power of three, right? Like he's
right?
got
That's
three
what I was
ghosts
thinking.
coming
Yeah,
up in there.
exactly.
Yeah.
Definitely.
And what's interesting is that there's you mentioned that he was he made a reputation by performing it himself, by reading it himself, and I've always been fascinated by the one person show versions of Christmas Carol. I have a friend who's an actor in Philly that does it, and of course Patrick Stewart was well known for doing that, and or even just reading it. So there's something that's very performance related, I think, to the story that lends itself to. I mean, that's what storytelling is. I mean, when you do storytelling as a lecturer, as a performer, I mean, you're drawing on sort of these ritualistic elements as well, the sort of folkloric nature of reading and speaking to an audience.
That's true. And my understanding is that he did write it so that it would be, and again, this would have been true of many writings at the time. If they were going to be read around the hearth or something like that, then they would have been written in a manner to where it could be kind of performed. But I was looking through the version that I got, that was the Oxford Classics version, and so it showed some of his notes, like his ledger that had the text that he had written, plus like the little notes that he scribbled to himself on the side, and things, chunks that he took out. I'm not going to say this is only if you're reading it to yourself, but I'm going to say this, and I'm going to take out this word, I'm going to interject this, so that it had a better like mouthfeel if he's performing it in front of people. And I thought that was really neat too. I do that. I mean, me and Charles Dickens, we were so alike, but I do that occasionally if I'm reading something to an audience, because sometimes I do storytelling and just as from a reading perspective, which can go either way. You have to really really be skilled reader in order to like read to an audience these days. And so I'll do the same, where something that I've written or something I'm reading, I'll change or embellish a little to make it more like readable out loud.
So what are your favorite kind of ghost stories to tell around this time of year, and just in terms of the content, but also what you like to actually tell to an audience?
Sure. So usually I get sort of like a specific set of requests. So it might be something more general where we're talking about just like folk tales, bits and pieces of folklore. And then for the event that you met me at, they specifically wanted me to tell like Chicago um, tales of the macabre that had to do with winter. And so I ended up choosing just disasters and terrible things in Chicago history that happened in the month of December.
Here in New Orleans, it's a Christmas, I guess, folklore tradition to honor Annie Christmas. I'm not really sure why Annie Christmas is named Annie Christmas, but basically the legend surrounding that is that Annie Christmas was a steamboat captain, and she was huge, like 7 feet tall, and she would just sort of, beat the whatever of bad men that were abusive to their wives or their children or something. So we've got another cautionary seasonal tale here in New Orleans. And this shows up. Some people say she was an actual woman that lived in the, mid 1800s. So this is a modern folklore that's passed down here for us. And
That's really
be nice
cool.
to your kids. Yeah.
Yeah, be nice to your kids and treat people with respect. Sometimes it's like this getting way too nitty gritty, but like sometimes there are those bits and pieces of stories where it's like women's empowerment is like embedded in the story somehow, and they do it in sort of like the sneaky ways, almost like sneaky ways like Charles Dickens having all of this pagan um and esoterica sort of embedded in the Christmas Carol and kind of like getting away with it, which is really cool. And just how much that is a part of us, even though we are also currently going through this period of like extreme Christian fundamentalism in some ways, especially like in the paranormal communities. I'm noticing there's a lot of push towards Christianity and like Catholic values, even if people aren't Catholic, this sort of bigger, this epic battle that's going on between good and evil, right? In all of our homes, demons that are trying to get us and could possess you. And if you turn on the TV, all you see are shows about people being possessed by the evil forces and everything. And so it's I don't know what is going on in our minds right now. It's not that we're that different. So, right, the more people change, the more we stay the same. But there's definitely this cultural moment where we're seeing more like it's this heightened interest in the occult at the same time that we have this heightened interest with these like fundamentalist kind of values. And it's interesting to be in this particular field right now with paranormal and stuff and watch these kind of philosophies like duke it out with each other. uh,
Isn't that similar to really like the whole spiritualist movement when it started was all about ghost stories, but also very Christian, but alternative Christian in a way, like
right,
science and all that kind of stuff.
right. It seems like we sort of come back, like we circle back to this like over and over again, but then it with like different flavors. Like right now we've got the flavor is like social media, which is, poisoning the well for everything in some ways. And so the way that we're communicating misinformation seems to be not congruous with how humanity has developed, but it's like, no, we're still none too bright at the end of the day. But I shouldn't be such a Scrooge about it. I should also say that like it helps us have conversations like these where we bring all of these different philosophies together and people are starting to, I think, rebel against speaking perspective, being involved in the paranormal community for like 20 years, just watching people sort of go through these pop culture phases of observing how people think about things and then starting to sort of challenge and think outside of that.
So what's your what's your favorite ghost story of this time of year? Is there like a winter ghost that is a good tale, good yarn for the winter?
My favorite ghost story that I like to tell this time of year is not a Christmas ghost. So the other friends I was talking about, I guess, are what I would consider Christmas ghosts. But then my Christmas ghost story for go-to here in Chicago is the story of the Iroquois theater fire, where it's a lot more than one ghost. which I can go into if you want a little bit. That's a long story, but I can attempt to condense it if you want. Then let me ask a question, since you're in New Orleans, do you know the story of Julie? Like the ghost Julie, the woman who froze to death on the roof of her lover's home?
No.
No, okay. I was researching New Orleans ghost stories like for this time of the year. A Creole woman who couldn't marry the man that she loved, and he wanted to marry her, but he couldn't, and he told her no because it wouldn't have been it was not acceptable, it was illegal. It was like legal at the time for you to court somebody biracially, but it was not legal to marry. And so he told her, I'll marry you if you are willing to sit naked on the roof on this very cold December night while he was partying with his friends downstairs, because that's exactly what you would do to the person you love.
Horrible.
Yes. And she did it because she loved him so much. She took all her clothes off and she went up on the roof. And when he came up from the party later, he panicked when he realized that she wasn't there. He thought she understood that he was just joking and that it wasn't a real ultimatum. And then he found her on the roof, frozen to death. So
It's horrible.
yes, it has some similar elements to other stories of like scorned lover stories, but there's New Orleans is just it's a whole topic that we could talk about more, that I'd love to learn more about too. But I find it very raw in a way that she was naked on the roof as well, and so it sort of adds this extra element of vulnerability to her story, and it really hits that message home about the struggles that that women faced at the time, but also just
Sure.
and then the creep factor, of course, for the ghost story itself, that she now supposedly haunts that location.
I mean, to me, it sounds
Maybe
like a
it's
cautionary tale too, right?
right,
Like a cautionary
right.
tale about what happens if you fall in love with a white man.
Yes.
Ooh. Yeah.
Can't help it.
And
Right.
does she haunt naked?
Listen to you.
That is a great question.
Stop it.
One of the number one questions that children always ask when I do ghost story presentations is, why do ghosts wear clothes? And to me, it's one of the best questions that there could be. So yes, I don't know if she's naked, actually. This is everybody's home is to learn more about Julie, but I don't know. I just found that story, and I thought it was beautiful, sad, interesting.
When we talk about ghost stories being at a certain time, it's also obviously very much about place too. So yeah, it's a classic.
True. That's true. Speaking earlier about, the origins of ghost stories told around a hearth, and now, when we live in a big city, we're not telling stories about what's lurking in the woods. We're telling stories of like the actual terrible things that have happened just down the street from us. And yeah, like what Lilith was saying, just that there's a little cautionary tale in all of these, whether they are based on a legend or whether they're really, based in history.
Right? Like that's the seed of folklore, right? Like we've got a little teeny bit of history and we've got a little teeny bit of myth and storytelling and lore sort of sandwiched together until we get something that really is strong enough for us to remember, right? And
Yeah.
yeah.
So I want to thank Amelia Cotter for joining us today and sharing some stories and folklore with us. And do you have anything coming out? Do you have a book coming out or anything you want to plug?
So next up, I'm going to be on Epic Realms on January 15th. That's another podcast. And then I'll be on the Folklore podcast as well sometime this winter. And if people are interested in getting a hold of me or booking me for an event or just connecting with me, I'm everywhere on social. And my website is ameliacotter.com.
All right. Sounds great. We'll put
Wonderful.
that our visuals there. So
Yay.
Thanks once again for joining us. We really appreciate you coming on and spinning a yarn with us.
Thank you. It was
Thank
amazing.
you. This was so fun.
All right. And we'll see you at the next storytelling event.
All right. Sounds good.
All right. Happy holidays to you.
Happy holidays, everybody.
All right. Well, that's our last episode for 2023.
Wow.
And yeah, it's been a little bit, and we're gonna be right back with you very early in the year in 2024 on January 3rd with our next episode on The Exorcist. What's the name of that film?
Believer. The Exorcist Believer.
Exorcist Believer, which is now out on Peacock. So we'll be talking about some of the occult elements and other religious elements in that film, harking back to the classic, of course.
I'm really excited because this episode, has been heralded as being, an homage to the divine African feminine. So we have a special guest coming next week, my good friend, Dr. Falta, who was actually the consultant for the film. So something real special coming for you.
Excellent. So join us in 2024. And once again, at the end of the year, we thank you for joining us and subscribing and sharing and checking out our Patreon site as we let you know every week. The www.patreon.com/popoccultureshow, and join us there and get all the goodies.
Thank you. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.